So the first question is for Stefan.
Stefan, is there a need, according to you and according to what you have shown to us, to introduce a regulation for limiting the, let's say, the potentially troublesome increase of low-cost air travel? A regulation kind of against low-cost air travel.
I would like to see, first of all, that subsidies are reduced that we have in aviation. They distort the economic basis for air transport. And then secondly, I would love to see that a carbon tax is introduced, and notably the $100 that we are discussing at the moment as something that is particularly high. There's scientific publications now putting the price, the future cost of carbon at $400 per ton. So I think it's fair to say we could also raise this bar quite significantly. The question you asked me, Eric, is a political one. Obviously, I'm a scientist. I wonder how we can bring this towards zero carbon to mid-century. And I would like to see both regulation as well as market-based approaches come together. But what we need for this is a timeline in which it's clearly detailed how emissions will decline over time so that we reach the zero carbon goal by mid-century, because that is something industry has refused to even think through today. We've always ever seen just images showing that some magic technology will save us all at some point. Well, we know that it takes at least 15 years for a new model to be developed, and I cannot see how this is a solution. So we need something that limits, yes, the higher true cost of air transport could be a starter. And then after that, we can discuss regulation that, for instance, would force airlines and the whole sector to transform. And I think if that comes together, we actually have a chance of reducing emissions significantly in the future.
Merci Stéphane. Une question pour Yves.
Thank you, Stéphane. A question for Yves Crozet. Business models I read on the iPad often tend to extrapolate from observations that are exact at a given moment by definition. Isn't there a risk of going astray and ignoring overriding trends, but that are related to societal, psychological, or ideological changes or other potential collective movements? Well, yes, of course. Extrapolation is always the hazard in human sciences, especially economics. But behind extrapolation, there's a key indicator called elasticity. It is known that over time, elasticity can change. So when your income increases, maybe you may want to spend a bit more for clothing, and then after a while, well, you get the most clothing you can buy, and you're going to move on to something else. And so the question is that of inferior, normal, and superior goods. And superior goods are those for which the elasticity is higher than 1. And what we can see now is that air transport is one of the superior goods. So that's why when there's an economic crisis as in 2008, air transport declines, because when you get poorer, you get rid of superior goods. But when there's economic growth, the superior goods go back up. And that's why I think that in the next few months or years, if the pandemic goes away, air traffic is going to recover very quickly, because for a few years still, it will become a superior good. Of course, there are people who travel too much. We showed that before, that business travel does not account for a big chunk of air transport. And in France, for all modes taken together, air, rail, and car, business travel declined by 30% since 2008. And with the pandemic and the rise of video conferencing, business travel is probably going to decline further, because if you need to take the plane every week for your job, it's not a superior good. And if you can reduce your air travel, you're going to do that, and that has already started for a lot of companies. However, if you only fly every 5 or 10 years for a leisure trip and your income goes up, well, one trip a year remains very attractive. And so you need to understand what the reasoning about elasticity said. It's not about what's going to happen for the wealthy, because the wealthy may travel a bit less because they've already traveled a lot by plane and they're getting older. But for the young population, the Asian and African, Latin American population, and the middle-income population in Europe, the appetite for air travel will remain very high. Thank you.
Another question for Stefan. Did you or anyone in the field of sociologic studies conduct the same kind of study about air travel social utility and you know what you have shown about the relative importance of the different types of travel? Or for instance, has it been done for other activities which are strong emitters of CO2, like for instance the use of internet?
That is a very good question, Eric. There's different types of economic studies that usually look into elasticities. Then we have studies that have looked into the effects of flight shame, also confirming that people can fly a lot less once socially triggered. Once there's discussion about the social norms that surround flying, people will actually fly less. It's to do with what we assume as personal responsibility and accountability, because so far we've been told technology will resolve it, and we don't have to pay personal attention to what we are doing. And I think this is the type of research we will see more of in the future, and that will probably change perspective on flight, because I think the consensus must be at this point it's not going to be resolved by technology, unfortunately.
A question for both of you. It is said that the most frequent flyers, who are very often upper social class members, as was shown on the slides, especially by Stefan, they are big contributors to total emissions by aviation. So emissions from aviation are socially marked. But isn't that the case of most anthropic sources of emissions?
I can translate into English for Stefan, because I guess he doesn't have the translation right now. You have said that the most frequent flyers, which belong to the highest classes of the society, are those which are the most important contributors to CO2 emission. I would say, of course, but isn't it the case for all human activities?
Rick, I unfortunately will not be able to answer this one, because I have to switch right now to Berlin to the ITB.
Yes, you're right. 15:14. You're right.
Goodbye,
okay.
everyone.
Thank you very much, Stefan. It has been very pleasant to have you here.
Well, I'm going to be forced to answer then, says Yves Crozet. And the key question is the purchasing power of rich people. If you consider that your income is very high and that you can buy yourself a swimming pool, a sauna, a hot tub, and you could potentially afford 2 cars, a small city car, and then a big 4x4, then the question is, as soon as you're wealthy mechanically, this money needs to be spent. So it may not be spent stupidly, it's not necessarily spent on something that's very harmful, but you may consider that your purchasing power gives you the resources. I read a German philosopher who was placating the European lifestyle based on waste, and he spent everything on a big aquarium in his home because he was very fond of fish. So, yeah, I can understand that his tastes differ from those of most people, but these tastes also have an energy cost, because investing big amounts of money into your home, this is also something that's going to consume energy. So the key question is that when your income increases, when you're young professional, and you're able to move around, it's very difficult to resist that temptation. Yes, quite. Any more questions that I could ask you, Yves in particular? Population growth leads to increases in transport requirements almost mechanically, as you said earlier, whereas the climate challenge leads some to ask for a decline, either via money, although you call that into question, or via regulations. So how to handle this dichotomy, or even this contradiction in terms between the two facts? Well, there's one way of looking at it which is very long-term. Population forecasts that were recently produced show that in 2100, China's population will have declined by about 20%. Ditto for India. So you need to understand that if we think in very short time horizons and people tell you resources are finite and we should stop doing everything right now because the future generations will have nothing left, well, there are thousands of, or maybe millions of future generations ahead of us until the sun explodes, maybe. So the world population is not going to grow indefinitely. As Mark Bloch says, if global population had grown 3% per annum in the last 2,000 years, you would have people stacked on top of each other for kilometers, and the size of the planet would grow at light speed. So exponentials do not work over the long term. So your starting principle is that within the next 50 or 100 years, global population is going to go down. So what we need to do in the current transition is not just the transition towards less mobility, but a transition towards global population that's going to grow further, then stabilize, then decline. And this population, by the year 21, 22, 2300, should still have decent living standards. And for that, population should benefit from the technical progress that we have accumulated and that we still have ahead of us. Thank you, Yves. There's also the question of the very long term, as opposed to the climate emergency and the carbon integral up to 2050 and after that. But unfortunately, we have to stop here. We could talk the whole afternoon talking about it, especially with you, because what you said today was particularly interesting. So once again, thank you to the three speakers, especially the only one left. And it's now time to take a short break of 10 minutes before we carry on with the roundtable moderated by Sophie Voinis.